In this video, I'll explain how to use a config file in your package. In many cases, packages have config files to allow package users to configure the behavior of the package a little bit. We're now looking in the configuration directory of my own personal blog, which is open sourced. And as you can see, my blog is a Laravel application. Let's take a look at one of the config files, the one from Horizon. You can see that there are many options here to customize the behavior of Horizon. Most of you probably know this, but I'm going to demonstrate it anyway so that we're all on the same page. You can get the value of a configuration key with the config helper. If you pass the configuration file name, you get all of the configuration in that file, but you can also get a specific key using the dot notation. Let's get this use value. And of course, it's set to default. Let's take a look at how we can add a config file to our package. Let's go to our service provider. And the good news is that if you're using our skeleton, we've already set up a config file. We do this via this hasConfig file method. This method will look for a configuration file that is by default in the config directory of your package and is named using the package short name. The package short name is the name of the package, but without Laravel. So in this case, example. If you would have named your package my package, then the configuration script of our skeleton would have named this file mypackage.php. But let's stick to Laravel example for now. While we're at it, I'm going to lose this comment and maybe also comment out the things that we don't need yet. If your package doesn't have views or doesn't need the migration, you can delete these two lines. But we're going to need them later on in the course. Okay, let's go to our example file and add our first option. We can lose this comment as well. And let's maybe add an option whose value will be outputted by the example command. It's a little bit of a silly option, but it'll help you understand how these things work. So let's name our option command output, and it's common to snake case these options and set it to a value output configured in config file, something like that. It's also highly recommended to put a comment before a config option that explains what it does. This value will be shown when the example command is executed, like that. Okay, now let's make use of this option. And let's add a variable text here, and let's reach into our own config file, example command output, like that. And let's use that in the comment. Before testing this out in a real application, let's write a test for this. I'm going to rename this file example command test, as this file contains only tests for this command. Let's rename this to it can output the configured value. And let's add an extra assertion here. And to check for output, you can call expects output. And let's expect the value in our configuration file. Let's run this test. And sure enough, it passes. Now in your tests, you can also dynamically change the configuration. Let's add a little test for that as well. In a real-world packet, I probably wouldn't write a test for this, but this is just to show you that you can change config values dynamically. And how you can do that is with config, and then call set upon it, then the key name of the config option. So in our example, it is example command output. Let's set this to something else, and now I expect the output something else here. Let's run this test. And it passes. Let's make sure that I'm not tricking you by making the test fail. Let's run this again. And sure enough, now it fails. Let's make it green again, like that. Okay, let's now go to our Laravel application that we created in the previous video. So in this application, our package is installed via a symlink. I can run my command here, php artisan my command. And you see that we get that value that we put in the config file. Let me show you a little shortcut that I'm using for PHP Artisan. I have an alias A in my bash environment that expands to PHP Artisan. So whenever I type A, I'm executing artisan and can pass a command like that. It's a little bit shorter. Okay, so our configuration value is being picked up, but let's now assume that our package user wants to change that configuration. To do so, the package user must publish the config file. And publishing a config file means that we are going to copy it from the package code to the configuration directory in the project. To do this, the package user must execute a command. And we've already put that command in the README file. You can see it in the installation instructions. And it's this one, PHP artisan vendor publish. And if we were to only execute that part, then Laravel will ask, hey, what do you want to publish? I have a couple of things here. But if you add a tag to a command, then Laravel knows exactly what we want to publish. And by default, our package service provider will add a tag for this. That is the package short name. So the package name without the Laravel prefix, and then suffixed with -config. Okay, let's execute this command in our project. When I refresh the config directory, you can see the published config file here. Let's make this a little bit smaller, and let's change this value. Changed in project, something like that. Now let's see what happens when we execute our command. Changed in project. So now we're not using the default configuration value anymore, but the overridden one. I think you must think of the configuration file as a file that contains the default configuration values. And you should choose defaults that will probably work for most of your users. And if your users want to change the defaults, then they can publish the file. Another good thing to know about config files is to know that these files will be merged. Let's give an example of that. Let's go to a Tinker session and dump out all of the example config values. So right now it's only command output. Let's now add a new option in the package config file. Another option, another value. And let's take a look at what config example returns now. And we see that it returns that new option. And I see that I forgot to snake case it. Let's do that quickly. So you have a good example. So what Laravel does behind the scenes is not simply reading this file, but it will always read the package config file and it will merge it with the config file that is published in the project. So if you want to add a new config option to an existing package, it's safe to do so. This isn't a breaking change, as people that have already published the config file will get the new option too. To use a config file in your package, the only thing that you need to do is to call this hasConfigFile method. Let's take a look at what happens behind the scenes. This method will call two native Laravel methods under the hood. Let's go to the Laravel documentation to discover what they are. So this is the package development page. Let's go to configuration. And the first thing that hasConfigFile will do under the hood for you is to make the config file publishable. This is done by calling publishes and pass it the path to the config file in your package and the path of the config file in the project. There's also a tag option that you can give here, but that's not shown in this little example. If I scroll a little bit down, then we see the second method that hasConfigFile will call for you, and that is merge config from. And what this method will do is that it will merge the values in the config file of your package with the config values in your project. But you shouldn't care too much about that. You can just call hasConfigFile. In the next video, we are going to take a look at how we can add migrations and models to your package. See you there.